For those of you who follow this channel on a regular basis, you know that I like to watch featurettes, right? I tend to watch a lot of stuff and cover a lot of different things, especially in regard to marketing. But featurettes oftentimes give you a more in-depth perspective behind a project, right? It's one thing to appreciate a work on the cinematic lens or maybe the smaller screen on what's presented to you maybe in the way of a trailer. It's another thing to look deeper and to understand the philosophies of and the guidance of the people behind the project as to materialize a certain work. I feel that covering Dahmer, to some degree, because I did say that Evan Peters provides a compelling performance, I think it's deserved to consider this project on that level. Because as I stated with the trailer, I'm going to try and keep this video a bit more simplified in regard to my perspective on Dahmer. I definitely went far deeper there with the trailer videos I covered for trailer number 1, trailer number 2. I'm going to try again and maintain a more simplified lens here, given that I've already given you my feelings by and large for the show in more specific detail. But broadly speaking, what appears to be a very competent series in production, I see a mixture of response in the future to this show. I think it's reasonably filmed. Evan Peters' performance is strong at producing a reinterpretation of his very infamous historical face. And I did think, in comparison to other Netflix fare that has come out previously themed around American serial killers, for example, like I stated in that original video, extremely wicked, shockingly evil, and vile. I voiced my complaints in the early day in large part to the marketing of that show. I thought it wasn't respectful at all in tone and the way that it was advertised of, oh, this is going to be in select theaters, it's gotten an awards run. It's like, but you're depicting a story about a serial killer, right? This isn't like some fictionalized story made by some very well-known filmmaker, right? It's not that type of story. This is depicting something atrocious in American history. Dahmer was marketed much better, even though the title I still think is not perfect. Dahmer, Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story. Like, you could have omitted one of the Dahmers, just to be clear. It's very clunky, at least on a series name. It might be a competent watch, but, I did see some grievance points with it, in that from what I've heard, I made reference to specific videos there that I had come across preceding my coverage of Dahmer. There is some reinterpretation here in the focus of the story. It's not 100% accurate. And, to be fair, there are differences in translations when it comes to biographical pictures, right? Not every translation is perfect by any means. It's the same measure what you speak of maybe in the fictional space of an adaptation of another storytelling form being brought to the screen. Certain revisions apply when you bring a story in narrative form to the screen. There's just a different style. But when you're dealing with a story like Dahmer, it seems a bit disrespectful to perhaps taint the vision according to indifferent whims to what history remembers. There are some strokes of the story that the angle, perhaps, of what the story is trying to drive at in message and theme is different from what actually occurred in history, and sort of muddles the perception. I also see a series like this, again, as not having the most serviceable debut. While I think, again, there's enough acclimates behind it to gauge people's attention. I mean, Ryan Murphy's producing this, and he's made an exorbitant amount of work on Netflix that's certainly gotten a lot of attention across the board. Evan Peters is behind this, and he's a very talented actor, in my opinion. This is a very different performance from what I'm familiar with of him. I've mostly seen him within, like, the comic book movie space, or streaming, if you want to count WandaVision. But he was, I believe, I forget how involved he was, but he was in American Horror Stories, which I believe, again, Ryan Murphy was affiliated with. And I do see, let's say from WandaVision, I did see shades of a more horror, thriller-centric performance. He can play a darker role, and I do think he's a good casting choice. He certainly appears this way with Jeffrey Dahmer. I do see, though, a show like this, broadly speaking, again, this is going to have very mixed appeal, right? Some people, might, like me, I like documentaries. I like real stories brought to screen, even though, again, considering that this has some revisions, I'm a bit dissuaded from that. It's not 100% authentic. But a story like this, I'm not interested in serial killer fare. It was hard for me to get through reading a biographical account on Wikipedia of Jeffrey Dahmer's story about wanting to stop reading. It's a incredibly alarming and gross experience. very distasteful to read. I mean, it's true, but it's true to history, horrifically, but it just makes you feel really sick when you read it. It's one thing to read a story. Watching it, I mean, again, the trailers can only advertise so much, given, YouTube content constraints. There are certain things they would not allow, and I am worried to some degree, of how far the series will go. I don't need a depiction of what actually happened, and even the trailer made me wince. I don't need to see events as they're portrayed, right? It's one thing to read about, it's another thing to actually see it on screen. I don't need the visual aids, thank you very much, for a story like Dahmer. I could see, again, maybe some people being interested, especially people, let's say, within psychology circles, being like, hey, let's learn more about, Dahmer's story, right? Maybe let's get a deeper perspective in psychology of a very corrupted man through Evan Peters' performance. I could see that appeal, or maybe psychology students as well. I think for the general viewer, though, I got my threshold, and this definitely surpasses it by many measures. And I would think I can speak for the majority of our people who are like, I don't like, to watch content like this, even if it's based on a true story. So I don't necessarily see this having the most serviceable debut, maybe a very prominent one. Maybe it'll do well in the ratings. I mean, who knows? But I don't know. I think it's definitely going to get a mixed response. I've never seen shades of that. But, I mean, from overall reception. I am curious, though, to see the perspective, again, going in, to get a behind-the-scenes look at the project and what was envisioned, right? And we're dealing with the focal point casting here with Evan Peters, who's playing Jeffrey Dahmer. So it's interesting, I think, to gauge what he saw in the character and how he matched his performance to provide an authentic portrayal. In the measures of what he's portraying, again, the story has some meddling in regard to its historical authenticity, but his performance seems to be matching. In especially the seriousness and the tone, I think and the look, it's satisfactory to what you would expect. Here we go. I'm going to cue up the featurette and we can watch this together.
Well, I sort of started with a blank slate with Dahmer. I only had the image of the hazmat suits and the blue vat coming out of the building, which I didn't even know was an apartment complex. I found out later that it was the Oxford apartments where he committed most of his acts. Ryan sent me the scripts and then called and said, Dahmer is interesting in that he is almost regretful and has guilt and sort of confusion about what went on. He's doesn't really have the charming, mischievous smile. He's a docile, sort of aloof, and almost disassociated from what he did.
Based on my reading of the story, those are accurate attributes.
And he told me also to watch the Stone Phillips interview, and so I watched that and then proceeded to read.
Not sure I want to watch that, but I might give it a look. I was
able to read the police report and his confession. I found on YouTube some audio of what sounds like a psychologist interviewing him, or even a detective, where he's sort of relaying sort of what he went through, and the way that he's speaking is very candid and very normal. Again, it was so jaw-dropping that it all really happened, that it felt important to be respectful to the victims families, to try to tell the story as authentically as we could. And you need to have certain plot points because he did do these things, but you don't need to embellish them.
Okay.
You get it. We don't need to see it over and over again. Honestly, I was very scared about all of the things that he did, and diving into that and trying to commit to that was absolutely going to be one of the hardest things I've ever had to do in my life, because I wanted it to be very authentic. But in order to do that, I was going to have to go to really dark places and stay there for an extended period of time.
Well, that's true.
I have to say that the crew was instrumental in keeping me on the guardrails. I cannot thank them enough, and I could not have done any of this role without them. Specifically Sarah, our focus puller, who was just such a breath of fresh air and light, when we were filming some of these horrific scenes. Jason, our DP, who sort of kept reminding me of sort of why we were doing it. It was easy, showing up there every day, telling the story of Jeffrey Dahmer, to get lost in that. It was a challenge to try to have this person who seemingly
it might have just been enough for me to read through the narrative.
All of it had this entire world that he was
rather than watch the series.
So we had one rule going into this from Ryan, that it would never be told from Dahmer's point of view. As an audience, you're not really sympathizing with him. You're not really getting into his plight. You're
That's
more
good input.
watching it, from the outside. It's called the Jeffrey Dahmer story, but it's not just him and his backstory. It's the repercussions. It's the society. It's this how society and our system failed to stop him multiple times because of racism, homophobia. It's just a tragic story that affected everybody. Gets their side of the story told, and it's really the Jeffrey Dahmer story is so much bigger than just him.
I appreciate that take. Again, I don't know if I'm going to watch the show, because it was hard enough for me to read the story without wanting to upchuck, and actually watching a demonstration of that on screen. From what Evan Peters is saying, it sounds like they were very respectful in the portrayal. Again, there is an argument to be made based on what I've heard, and I believe the original video that I cited, I think that came from, or the article that was featured there, I believe came from somebody who was involved in the original situation with Dahmer in regard to the reporting. So it would be a credible source, at least from what I understand. There is an argument to be made that attention to this series won't be as revered because of certain contributions that don't model history specifically as it relates to the Dahmer story. The emotional appeal, though, I understand why the filmmakers perhaps went with that angle. I agree. That was a very good contribution on part of Ryan Murphy and when Evan Peters volunteered, that the focus should be on the victims, right? To not glorify the actions of a serial killer. To keep it focused on the victims and to make sure that that's the image maintained. That's a good input decision. I agree with that wholeheartedly. Good move on part of the film crew. I understand the desire to marry this in some way to a modern parallel. Because today you look at the world as it exists in regard to social conversation, a variety of topics, many of which perhaps do intersect with the Dahmer story. I understand the temptation to marry history to the modern world in regard to theme. I get that. But I do think, again, there is an argument to be made based on some of these additions not matching history succinctly. I do think it is a legitimate complaint for somebody who perhaps looks at this and says, well, I find it disrespectful to meddle with history and not preserve it 100% according to what was originally written. I get that. Maybe there are ways to tailor the angle of the story that you wouldn't have to make their revisions. I mean, I don't know. There are some elements here, as I stated, and as that video went far more into detail, that seem to, again, point to differences in input that might be viewed as a disrespect. I could see that being a legitimate complaint from those who choose to watch it. Or even maybe those who don't. They're just even looking at the story, perhaps people who happen to be within the circles of the victims, right? And being like, well, this isn't specifically honoring, I hate to use that word, but it's not portraying an accurate, succinct feel to the best of its ability, right? I get it. But I do, again, look at this project. I understand from the concerns of the filmmakers why the interpreted value of making a parallel to the modern world here. I get the desire to do so. I'm just hesitant to say I'm behind it in the way that it's materialized, and I think others will express the same sentiment that I am. Evan Peters' take, though, I appreciate it. I might not watch this series. Again, I'm hesitant because I have my threshold, right? And I like learning about history, even maybe some of the more sordid affairs of it. But a story like this, I mean, I've certainly got enough information in part of the biographical reading that I'm not sure we need a dramatization of it. To be clear, though, Evan Peters did say to not, how did he explain it? I think he worded it pretty well. There's no need for embellishment. We don't need to see it over and over. That sounds to me like perhaps a series, and again, I'll if I do even think of watching this, it'll be after consulting intensively reviews on a content level to understand how far the series does go, right? If it maybe just gets to that line where the audience can interpret what's happening, I mean, that might be hard enough, but that would be far different than actually seeing something depicted on screen. That would be what I worry about. I don't want to sit through the scenes of what would be akin to a serial killer's actions or somebody with the history of Dahmer. That's just not, it would dissuade me from watching, even though, again, it's a true story, or it's inspired by a true story, and it's trying to realize that there would be a complaint to be made. And plus, in that case, it'd be like, well, then, the content doesn't border on exploitation of the horrific acts, right? That'd be another issue in itself. We'll see how this fares as a series over time, right? I've heard mixed reception thus far now. Well, okay, let me clarify that a bit. I've heard praise on its quality and its effort. But I've also heard the dissuasion, perhaps again from the 100% or to the best of their ability, lack of authenticity, in certain measures. And perhaps there's some general audiences who might, or even, I think there was some response from the victims I came across too. I didn't read it in detail, but I remember seeing a take on that. Or even just some viewers who are like, this is not up my alley in regard to content tastes. And that is an understandable complaint, right? Dahmer will not be for everybody, and I think everyone would agree with that. Evan Peters' response here, though, it paints to good decisions. It certainly, I would say, speaks to the strengths of Dahmer. It also changes my perspective to certain complaints that I had, and it makes me look on it with, especially in terms of him portraying the role of Dahmer, and maybe with Ryan Murphy's input and the crew in regard to maybe Evan Peters inquiring on how to best maintain a character like that and present him. That I respect. We'll see what happens with Dahmer over time. It's a complex story, to be sure. It's a hard read. And again, I'd be curious to find out down below, do you see yourself watching this series? Or do you see yourself perhaps just sticking with me or read through? I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are down below on what angle you see yourself coming to this show. It's a fascinating one to gauge. Again, we'll see the audience response over time as more people, as this, I'm looking at this a bit late, about 10 days after it debuted, so apologies, I'm a little behind the curve on this, as I am apparently with everything these days, but it'll be interesting to see as the series, spends more time on Netflix, what the overall response is. I'm curious. I'm not sure I want to watch it, but Evan Peters' take makes me see this project, at least to the extent of his portrayal of the role and his interpretation of it and what he was thinking about going into manifesting the realization of Jeffrey Dahmer. It makes me at the very least look at him in the context of this movie with a more appealing lens, right? The project itself may be a different story, but Evan Peters and crew, as it relates to his performance, this featurette spoke to his credits, in my opinion. Thank you so much for watching this video. Before you bounce, feel free to drop a like and comment, subscribe to this channel with a ding on the bell, and share this video with your friends. And consider checking out the description here. There you'll find links to my other channels, as well as addresses to my other social media accounts and ways you can help support my work if you feel so inclined. May God bless you, and looking forward to when our paths cross again.